Welcome to Chapter 12. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about students that are on the autism spectrum disorder. This is one of those disabilities that gets a lot of press. It's a hot topic in the field of disabilities right now. However, I want you to understand that this is definitely still a low prevalence disability. Even though we hear the term a lot, it's being publicized extremely well. As you can tell, I got the puzzle piece in the background, which is one of the symbols for helping find a cure and come up with better interventions for this population. It's still a low prevalence disability. This particular disability and traumatic brain injury were the last two disability categories to be added to IDEA, and this was in 1990. So this is technically the newest set of disabilities, but that's got to be pretty funny to you guys because most of the time, thanks dog, most of the time this was probably done before you guys were born. I'll introduce you to my dog. Come here, buddy. Come here. He's normally not allowed on chairs. Come on. This is Brutus. A lot of times you might hear him in the background on any of my videos during my classes, but Brutus is about 1.5 years old and is still ill-trained. It's one of my largest failures as a teacher. Alright, so how is the autistic spectrum disorder actually defined? Autism spectrum disorder covers 3 specific syndromes. The first one is autism, the second one is Asperger syndrome, and the third one is pervasive developmental disorders not otherwise specified, or PDD-NOS. This one is very rare, and I have never come across students in the public schools that had PDD-NOS, but we'll cover it because these students are prevalent. They are in the schools today, so just so you know the terminology. So how is the autism spectrum disorder defined? These disorders share similar behavioral traits. These include problems with communication, problems with social skills, and a specific range or patterns of behaviors. Some of these students might exhibit a very, very narrow or limited range of behavioral or academic interests. So it's going to be important to learn how to accommodate these students and work with them to improve their behavior and social skills. 2 related disorders that were originally part of this spectrum but are no longer considered a part of it are Rett syndrome and childhood degenerative disorder. Both syndromes still remain in the DSM-4, but however, you do not need to know these for any type of exam. If your students have these types of disabilities, it's going to be important for you to go out and do the research and find out how you can better serve them. Here's a video further explaining the autism spectrum disorder.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sheldon Horowitz here at the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Welcome to the next of our Ask the Expert video series. Today what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about autism spectrum disorder, or autism. You'll notice that I use the term autism spectrum disorder because it is in fact a spectrum. It isn't a single disorder. Individuals fall on the spectrum in different ways, having different kinds of skills, different kinds of abilities, different kinds of characteristics, but they all share certain things in common, and we'll talk about those common features and characteristics in a moment. When we talk about autism, we often talk about pervasive developmental disorder, PDD, also referred to as PDD-NOS, or not otherwise specified. We talk about Asperger syndrome, sometimes referred to as high-functioning autism, and we talk about childhood disintegrative disability or disorder. So what are some of the characteristic features, predominant features of autism? Well, individuals who fall within this autism spectrum disorder have difficulties in social interaction, they have difficulties in communication, and they have difficulties in the area of behavior. So let's look at each of those individually. In the social interaction area, individuals with autism have great difficulty maintaining and establishing eye contact. They have difficulty reading facial expressions, and their facial expressions at times are also somewhat flat and not particularly expressive. They have difficulties with body posture, knowing how to move their body or moving their body in ways that endear them socially with their peers. They have difficulty with emotional signals, knowing when emotions are triggering certain kinds of responses or being aware of their own emotional status. They have difficulty in the area of reciprocity. That's the give and take that you experience when you're in social situations with others. Those who have autism also seem not to have a shared interest in or enjoyment with others. So their experience is a very personal, introspective, solo kind of enjoyment that they take in the kinds of ways that they behave socially. They are not at all tuned into or have difficulty tuning into the achievements of others. They have difficulty understanding other people's feelings. And especially when you think about young children, one of the hallmark early signs of autism is that they don't do that social, fun, interactive kind of stuff. So for example, playing peekaboo. You know, young children will often break out into laughter because it's fun and there's a smile attached to it and they giggle. Young children with autism tend not to do that, and they're often not comforted by touch, which can be very disconcerting, certainly to young families, to parents, and to siblings. In the communication area, we talk about people with autism having difficulties both in verbal and non-verbal domains. We very often see a delay or even a lack of talk. Young children with autism will sometimes begin to develop language and then it'll abruptly stop. In many cases, that language just never develops. They have difficulties in the communication domain with taking turns. So if they say something and when they say something, it's often not in a reciprocal kind of give and take way. They have difficulty remaining engaged in conversations. Very often what we hear and what we see in the communication domain is stereotyped kind of communication. So they'll often repeat a phrase or repeat a sound or repeat a word. And they may also be echolalic. They may repeat something that someone else says. They may echo the actual words that someone else has said. Again, in the communication domain, individuals with autism have difficulty taking the listener perspective. They have difficulty understanding and responding to humor. Innuendo is very difficult for them. And again, as mentioned before in the social interaction area, they tend to be concrete and focus on their self-needs as opposed to the needs of others around them. In terms of their behavior, very often individuals on the autism spectrum focus on parts or pieces of things and not the whole. They may focus on a button on a shirt, or they may focus on the wheels of a truck, but not necessarily how that truck works or that a button is part of a piece of clothing that has a particular function. They often have preoccupations, so they may be preoccupied with toothbrushes, or they may be preoccupied with certain kinds of toys or certain kinds of objects around the house. They have a very high need for sameness. Routines are very frustrating for them, and transitions tend to be very, very difficult. Classic kinds of autism often are evidenced in some rocking behavior. So there's a rocking back and forth of the whole body. There may be some flapping behavior, which could be arms or legs or both. And what I call twiddling, which is taking something and shaking it in your hand or moving it back and forth, banging it around, tapping with it. Very often individuals on the autism spectrum disorder spectrum have hypersensitivities to certain things. So for example, the texture of clothing or the texture of food, or they may actually show a lack of awareness of those kinds of things. Of great interest is that when you think about the autism spectrum disorder, those individuals could be of low IQ. They could have pretty significant cognitive and intellectual challenges, or they could be gifted. There are features of ADHD that we see in many individuals on the autism spectrum, and anxiety and depression are often complicating factors in this set of disorders. We all know of movies like Rain Man, where we see someone who has extraordinarily highly developed and sophisticated abilities. Individuals with autism, some individuals with autism present with savant-like skills. They're incredibly capable of remembering things, lists, or maps, or dates, or even have certain gifts in the area of music. They have some unusual sensory issues. So, for example, individuals with autism may react differently to touch. They may find touch very aversive, or they may have difficulties managing touch and not realize that they may be touching someone too hard, or they may tap someone when they really mean to touch them harder. It appears that some individuals with Asperger, with autism spectrum disorder, may have difficulties with modulation of pain, and again, they have difficulties often with certain textures. Also seen in that autism population are difficulties with sleep, and activities for daily living are almost always interrupted. The ability to care for yourself, the ability to dress and eat and feed, and do certain kinds of activities for daily living, which may include, in some higher functioning individuals, the ability to travel from one place to another, manage money, and do those kinds of activities for daily living. For more information about autism spectrum disorders and for information about learning disabilities and related disorders of attention and behavior, please visit the ld.org website.
So when it comes to characteristics of students that are classified as having autism, remember, this is just one specific disorder under the autism spectrum umbrella. IDEA 2004 lacks a lot of specificity as far as it's not specific to explain exactly what this means. All I can tell you is if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. They are all individuals just like everybody else. And once again, they'll have problems with communication, social skills, or may have a restrictive range of interest or repetitive behaviors. Approximately 75% of people with autism also have intellectual disabilities. There's a high level of comorbidity, while 25% have average to above average intelligence. A lot of times you might see in the news a number of students are classified as being autistic savants. However, even though they get a lot of press, this number is very, very small. But they tend to be very, very interesting to the public at large. Just so you know exactly what I'm talking about, here's a video of an individual that's been classified as a savant. The skills he has in visual memory and retention are absolutely astounding. Check it out.
Stephen Wiltshire from London is a star among savants. His nickname is the Living Camera. Stephen is autistic. He lives in a world of his own. Communication is difficult for him. He didn't speak his first words, pencil and paper, until he was 5. Yet when he was 11, he drew a perfect aerial view of London after only one helicopter ride. Even the number of windows in all the major buildings in his drawing was correct. For this film, we're testing the Living Camera in Rome. Stephen has never seen the Eternal City from above before. After only a 45-minute helicopter flight, we'll ask him to draw a 5.5-yard panoramic picture of the historic city centre. Without having a second glance at it, Stephen has 3 days. In these 3 days, Stephen will have to keep thousands of details in his head. The innumerable cupolas, the tiny winding streets, all the balconies and windows of the endless array of houses, and each and every column and window arch of Rome's major sites, from the Pantheon to St. Peter's to the Colosseum. 5.5 yards of paper can look scarily empty. The amazing thing, Stephen starts the drawing as we would, with the Church of St. Peter's. But he doesn't do any sketches, nor roughing out of the space for the drawing. It's as if the panorama already existed within his head, with all the proportions, all the roads, all the details. At the end of the second day, Stephen is a good halfway through his creation. After 3 days of his drawing marathon, even Stephen Wiltshire starts to tire. He has filled in more than 5 yards of paper in fine pencil. He has been restlessly aligning window to window and house to house, because Stephen loves to be applauded for his art. In the left corner, he's finally reached the ruins of the Forum Romanum. Stephen's sister Annette is rejoicing with him. He's made it. Obviously, he's pleased with his work. Yet our vexing question still remains. How precise was Stephen's ability to memorize? Is it really true that you could only see a single curve of the Tiber from above? We started to compare the accuracy of the drawing with the real thing. Is Stephen's version of St. Peter's cupola too dominant? Yet here again, like with the curve of the Tiber, Stephen is frighteningly right. We wondered if the famous Roman hill should probably stand out more in Stephen's panorama. But again, Stephen had seen it better. From 1,000 feet up, the hills are, optically, almost level. Checking the Pantheon, we did discover some minor inaccuracies on the roof. But the number of columns of the portal is, again, absolutely correct. And, despite our doubts, Stephen has drawn one of the most complex buildings, the Colosseum, so precisely, it's practically a blueprint of reality. Stephen was also accurate in the instances we checked of nameless buildings and side streets. Had he had more time, his sister Annette believes, he would have put in even more detail.
Some of the areas of all of the park, lots of detail, remembered things and of the some of the cities and the neighborhoods and the villages. And then the easy part is St. Peter's and Forum and Colosseum, and memorize it by head and by memory.
Was that amazing or what? Think about the amount of intelligence it would take to process the visual landscape of a complicated city like Rome, and then be able to completely turn around and recreate it on that long drawing. I felt so bad. It took that poor guy 3 days. I'm surprised he didn't have any type of behavioral breakdown, because I would if I was expected even just to draw circles on that for 3 days. Okay, let's talk about another set of characteristics focusing on students with Asperger syndrome. This is a collection of behavioral characteristics that are aligned with problems with social skills. They may have restricted or unusual or obsessive interests. Children with Asperger's development of speech and language may be at the same rate as children without disabilities, but once again, this is looked at as an individual basis. One thing it's going to be important for you to know, when you're working with these students in classrooms, they take language very, very literally, and they struggle to understand jokes or idioms. Do not use those. His sarcasm especially will not be fully understood in many cases. So make sure your communication with these students is clear. These students may have difficulty interpreting behavior. They may have problems understanding the feelings or emotions of others. This could also include sensory problems, inflexibility with classroom routines, especially if it's changed due to any type of function in the school. And they may be perceived as socially awkward. If you've watched The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon is a perfect example of what they're talking about. Here's a presentation put together by an individual that has Asperger's, better explaining it. It's a PowerPoint with some music in the background, and it also talks about some pretty famous individuals that are suspected or have been diagnosed with having Asperger's syndrome. Check it out. Okay, I hope that video helped explain a little bit more, and it was probably a nice review of information I talked about already. But let's look at the characteristics when it comes to PDD and NOS. These problems occur in the same areas: communication, social skills, or a restricted range or unusual interests. And once again, this is really subjective. Who says something's unusual or not? However, these problems might not occur in all three areas and may be very mild. So instead, this diagnosis is used rather than to require them to have a diagnosis of autism. So how prevalent is this? In 2007, the Center for Disease Control reported that this was 1 in 50. 1 in 50 children are on the autism spectrum disorder. You might hear from the news it's 1 in 120, 1 in 75. It's very, very difficult to gauge these numbers depending on how this research was conducted. But in general, I'll go with the CDC. Epidemiological studies show that the rate of autism is increasing. An epidemiological study society over a long period of time. And explanations for these increases probably improved diagnostic methods. We're getting better at identifying these symptoms. A broader use of terms instead of just the term autism, with Asperger's being included, it's going to increase those numbers. And there might even be an actual increase in the condition. Despite this increase, autism spectrum disorders remain very low in incidence. So once we get to the causes and prevention, let's look at the causes. No definitive cause has been found. That puzzle piece in the background is a perfect symbol for they are still trying to put the pieces of this problem together. Several causes have been ruled out. And one of the first ones they had to rule out, get this, they used to tell mothers that it was their fault, that they were uncaring or a cold mother. What they based that on is beyond my comprehension. However, we know that that is not the case. Experts now believe that there is a neurological disorder and there's a genetic basis for this condition. Speculations on the causes of autism can be extremely dangerous. I said before, you guys should check out the vaccination documentary on Frontline. Parents may not get their children vaccinated, which leaves them unprotected against other diseases or just vulnerable for other life-devastating conditions. This is all happening at a time where you have parents that are choosing not to vaccinate their children, going to school along with parents that can't afford it. This is a disaster waiting to happen. Always defer to professionals in the field regarding practices such as this. Don't go to Wikipedia. Go to research-proven sites. So as far as prevention goes, prevention is not currently a realistic goal. What we're looking at is educational interventions to help improve the symptoms or the severity of individuals on the spectrum. When it comes to assessment, experts are focusing more attention to early screening and identification. This disability is not diagnosed until 2 years after the initial signs appear. The American Academy of Pediatrics has developed recommendations for screening and the diagnosis of these children. Check it out in your text. Because once again, early diagnosis is going to be vital so we can intervene early and help the child grow and develop. And this is going to lead to better outcomes down the road. 3 considerations that inform the assessment process are maintaining a developmental perspective, including information from multiple sources, and using multidisciplinary assessments. It can't just come from one doctor. It's going to come from multiple sources. It's going to come from you in the classroom if you start observing some of these behaviors if you're working with preschool or early elementary school children. So it's going to be important that your observations are recorded and documented during this process. When it comes to early intervention, we know there's some successful early childhood programs out there. There's the Walden program, inclusive program for very young children with autism, and the TEACCH program. Let's take a look at a video that focuses on the elements of a successful program that's implementing the TEACCH model.
The acronym is the treatment and education of autistic and related communication handicapped children. The primary goal of TEACCH is to help the child with autism reach his maximum ability by the time that he's adult age to be as independent as possible, and for him to be a successful, happy member of the community. Good job. TEACCH is a complete program of services for people with autism, which makes use of several techniques, not just one. The physical arrangement of the room, the individual workstations, the individual schedules, the visual cues. That's all part of TEACCH. And also understanding the world of autism. You have to know the whole culture of autism. Children with autism are different than regular children. They process things differently. Like children with autism, they learn better visually than verbally. Like if you give them a verbal direction, they may not understand. But if you show them visually the direction, give them a visual cue, it makes it much more clearer to them.
Thank you. Good, okay. And people and animals.
Some parents get their children to early intervention, which starts at 2.5, 3 years old. But if not, then they would go into at age 5, when they go into regular school, they would start the TEACCH program. Our school, we keep them to 21. We keep children with autism to 21. You could use TEACCH combined with ABA, combined with the Miller method, combined in an inclusion setting. You could, different aspects of the program you could use in every methodology. Some students you can see, within a week's time, you see the change in the student. Others may take a little longer, maybe a month. Sometimes it takes the whole year. And even if it's a small little progression, that you see, it might be minute, but you do see improvement. Feelings, the speech makers when we go out. We have a shuttle. We go to BJ's and Target and McDonald's. It's like if we're doing the art. It's like recreational things. So this is a book that would go home with the kids. I would definitely recommend TEACCH for all children on the spectrum. There's many aspects of TEACCH that can be used that can benefit all children, such as the physical arrangement of the room, the individual schedules, the workstations, the visual cues. All students could benefit from that. I think you told us everything you wanted. You want White Castle, you want Baskin Robbins, and you want Popeyes. All right.
All right, I hope that presentation of the TEACCH model program gave you a better idea of what these programs are intending to do. But when it comes to any type of early intervention, the key elements are going to include a supportive teaching environment, helping students plan for generalization, to take the skills they learn in your classroom and use them in the community or in another class, setting your class up for predictable schedules and predictable routines. That is the best thing you can do for all students. It's going to let them get into the flow of your classroom model. If they know what to expect, that's less surprises. It reduces anxiety and lets them concentrate more on the learning at hand, rather than if you have a disorganized classroom where they don't know what to expect. Functional behavioral approaches to address behavior problems have also been successful. And we're looking at involving the family and supporting them, giving them the tools and the resources they need to help their child learn and grow, helping them learn to work with their child on behavior, social skills, academic skills. Getting the family involved is critical at every level. When it comes to teaching students on the autism spectrum disorder, many of the same principles and strategies that are effective for working with younger children also work for older children. Accessing the general curriculum is going to be key here. Traditionally, students with autism spectrum disorder have been taught using a totally separate curriculum. And when I first got into this field, you know where they put them? They put them in the classroom for students with severe behavior. Now, even though they might have a behavioral problem, they're going to require vastly different interventions than that population. They have definitely shifted. Over the past 2 decades, they have done a much better job aligning the curriculum for students on the autism spectrum disorder to be aligned with general education. This is going to allow them more accessibility. It's going to give them better behavioral models in the classroom, and it's also going to give them the primary access to a higher expectations when it comes to education. Some suggestions. What I would suggest for you is setting up your classroom and provide the following accommodations. Develop a schedule and stick to it. At all costs, you should avoid surprises or changes to any classroom routines. This is going to disrupt the student's learning and behavioral process. You want to use direct statements to the student. You want to provide explicit directions and let the student know exactly what you are expecting from them. Whether it's a homework assignment, an in-class task, making sure your directions are clear. Avoid using any type of slang or metaphors, and provide concrete examples. Concrete examples are those that the student can visualize, that they can see, that they can understand before they move on to the next concept. If you're using something that's abstract or something that they may not be familiar with, it's going to cause confusion and frustration, increase anxiety, and increase the potential for behavioral issues in your classroom. Remember, I'm all about being proactive, and these are all skills and all ways that you can be proactive in your classroom. Let's get a deeper understanding of how we can teach students on the autism spectrum disorder, and let's take a short little video break and check out what Temple Grandin has to say about overcoming autism. If you haven't seen the movie Temple Grandin, check it out. It'll give you a great perspective on how maybe some individuals with autism think and process information. She classifies herself as a visual thinker. I think you'll find her pretty interesting. Check it out.
Define and describe what autism is.
Autism is a neurological disorder where there's differences in the development of the brain. It ranges all the way from a child that's going to remain nonverbal for the rest of his life with a lot of handicaps up to geniuses, out Silicon Valley that do computer things, Tesla who invented the power plant. In a lot of school systems today, Einstein would be diagnosed with some kind of autism problem, no speech until age 3. A little bit of the autism trait, you might get a genius, he's not very social. Yeah. If you've seen that Social Network movie, that's a very good example of Asperger's, which is mild autism.
You think that Mark Zuckerberg is that?
If that movie shows him accurately, I also read the book, if it shows him accurately, it is. And one of the things about being an autistic person, you've got to learn social rules by being taught. And the thing is, you always keep growing. And I hope that Mr. Zuckerberg gets good advice on how to invest his money into socially good things. I was very pleased to find out about the donation he did to the school.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that you have to learn social things by being taught.
You have to learn that.
How old were you when you started to realize that you had to learn this?
Well, you see, in the 50s, social rules were pounded into kids. And I'm seeing a lot of kids on the mild end of the spectrum today having more problems today than not getting jobs. Because in the 50s, they pounded things into you, like saying please and thank you. You don't push in line. Learn how to take turns. You got to be a good sport. Today we got TV shows teaching people that, you kick the weak off the show. Yeah. You don't work on helping the weak.
That's so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, what do you think?
I absolutely despise those shows because they teach the wrong values.
But they're so fascinating to people. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't watch them. I think they're just horrid. And I've only watched them enough to learn about them. I absolutely hate them because what happened to the values of helping the weak? I mean, I grew up in an era where Roy Rogers rules for living, and you look them up on the internet, and they're good rules. Things like you protect the weak, you're polite, you're neat and clean, you're kind to animals. Those are part of Roy Rogers rules for living.
Yeah, well, the animals one you certainly took to heart, didn't you?
Well, I've been working with improving, handling of animals for a long time. Because one thing I'm interested in is we've got to work on doing things to make real improvements on the ground.
How did you get connected to animals? I mean, you seem to...
Well, when I was in high school, we had horses there. I loved riding and horses. Oh, I was like absolute horse nut. And then when I went out to Arizona, my aunt's ranch, I watched cattle going in the squeeze chute, and the cattle we put in the squeeze chute to get their vaccinations. And that's shown in the movie. And it's a metal stall, and it kind of squeezes them up each side. And I noticed that some of the cattle just kind of relaxed. So I went and tried out the squeeze chute, and it calmed down my nerves. You see, there's a number of kids on the autism spectrum that will seek deep pressure on wide areas of their body, and it will calm them down. And of course I got fixated on the squeeze chute, so then I had to go to every feed yard in Arizona to learn about squeeze chutes, and then it helped get the interest in cattle going. You know, this brings up another thing. You take the fixation and you broaden it out. You know, I had to learn a lot of other things about cattle handling, about design of facilities. You know, half of the cattle in North America, including half the cattle here in Canada, are handled in a piece of equipment I designed called a center track restrainer system.
How does that make you feel?
That makes me feel really good.
Yeah. It's like it... Was there ever any part of you that wanted to prove that you could do this?
There was definitely a part of me in my early 20s where I wanted to prove to people I wasn't stupid.
Right.
That was a very big thing.
Did people call you stupid? Like, how did they...
Well, a lot of people thought I was a stupid retard that couldn't do anything. And when that dip vat got built and they said it was a masterpiece, and that did happen, and the thing with the metal plate put in there, that
These are all things that you designed and arranged, right?
Everything, all the design stuff was accurate. Now, the movie showed them wrecking my dip vat, putting a metal plate in there. That was taken out and fixed. And I went on to build a whole bunch more of those, and that's how my design business got started.
Okay, I hope you found that video with Temple Grandin interesting. Her movie is absolutely spectacular. Claire Danes does a wonderful job, and it also shows some of the struggles families go through in providing an appropriate education for their son or daughter with autism. And it's not just a documentary, it's also extremely, extremely entertaining. You would never guess what Temple Grandin would end up doing for a living. She designs slaughterhouses for cattle, and it's pretty unbelievable. She's highly respected in that field and highly respected in the provision of services to students with autism. I've seen her speak, and it's quite incredible. All right, to continue on teaching students on the autism spectrum disorder, once again, we're going to go back to positive behavioral supports, determining the function of each of the child's behaviors to determine what can we do to help change it. And are there any alternatives we can teach the child in order to behave more appropriately? Functional communication training involves teaching students appropriate responses so they are functionally equivalent and they're able to solve problems. They're going to need to be taught how to act in certain situations. I'm going to show you a few pieces of technology that can help them be better prepared to handle social situations in the future. If at all possible, providing activities and activity schedules that are visual, that they can actually see, it'll give students with autism spectrum disorders more independence. I'll show you, we've already talked about a couple of apps that focus on social stories, but it helps them understand other individuals' emotions, feelings, and behaviors so they can better interpret them themselves. When it comes to technology, approximately 50% of people on the autism spectrum disorder do not talk. They will use augmentative communication devices or alternative means to communicate. In the speech and language chapter, we talked a little bit about these devices. These are the same ones individuals with autism would use. And technology can help these students simplify and structure the environment through visual supports and increase opportunities for language using assistive communication devices. One of the most prevalent ones and one validated strategy is called PECS. And what PECS is the Picture Exchange Communication System. As you can see here, there's a whole screen of just really easy to interpret graphics to help students express their wants or needs. Brutus, shh. With this PECS system, however, I would suggest using more realistic pictures. PECS is probably going to be on the way out because there's much more technology out there now that'll help us take actual pictures versus cartoons. All right, let's look at some apps that we could use on the iPad or any type of tablet device that can help us better prepare students with autism to be more social. One of the first ones is called Find Me Autism. This is a free application that can assist students in interpreting others' behavior. Another one is directly made for students with autism. It's called the Autism 5-Point Scale, and it just helps them better interpret their level of behavior or their level of comfort in any situation. Another one is called ABA flashcards. These could also be used to help students learn to interpret emotions and learn to interpret others' feelings. There's also an app called My Life Skills Box that can help them learn the specific social skills they'll need to fit into any type of society, and even look at functional skills for work, for school, for whatever environment they're going to be expected to perform. A newer one that's a little more expensive is called Model Me Going Places, and what this does, it provides a visual cue for individuals to see how they should act or respond in certain social situations. What to do if a door is locked unexpectedly, what to do in any social situation they encounter within the community. And it gives them a visual representation so they can learn to model that behavior. If you have any more questions regarding apps, go to my LiveBinder site. There's going to be plenty of information there. This is an approach I just presented last year at the Ocala conference, which is the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence. And this is a presentation on apps for use with this specific population. And it goes all the way up from telling time, the 5-point scales included in there, and additional apps that can help you be more organized in the class and maintain a schedule that will help reduce anxiety and behavior for the students in your classroom. Go ahead and check it out. When it comes to transition through adulthood through this population, transition to preschool is a big step for these students. Most early identified children will receive intervention services, but when it comes to transition services for adults, they're going to need supported employment in order to function in the workplace. They're going to need some additional skills and additional intervention so they're prepared to meet the social demands of any work environment. Transition outcomes become the focus of educational programming from middle school, high school, and beyond. They're going to require the understanding of support from others in their community and are going to benefit from probably a good set of community experiences so they know what the expectations are prior to graduation. It's testing those waters and going to see if they actually know and can meet the expectations of a work environment, of just going to a restaurant can be an anxiety provoking situation. So anything you can do to get them better prepared, give it a try. When it comes to collaboration for this population, these students must have access to that least restrictive environment. It's going to require modifying or adapting the curriculum that can allow students to maintain their engagement in general education. That's where they should be educated. This could be done through using peer supports, using interdisciplinary teams to help make this possible. And if you need to, you can consult a behavior analyst or behavior specialist who can help you with specific approaches and those to help you meet your learning objectives. In Akron Public Schools, they currently have a behavior specialist that can be called in to help you work on these type of behavioral occurrences in your classroom. Her name's Lisa Johnson. She does a fantastic job working with educators to make their environments a much more comfortable place for the whole class as well as individual students. When it comes to partnerships with families, there can be some difficulties here due to a child's lack of independent play, the dislike of physical affection, and social avoidance. These students may also act out in public places. So providing support to parents, getting them hooked up with support groups that have parents that are going through the same thing are going to be paramount to helping them cope and reduce stress in the family life. We've already talked about the TEACCH program. That program offers support groups and information on accessing community services. That's going to be critical in helping them reach their educational and transitional goals. All right, let's look at 2 quick questions to help you review for this chapter. Let's look at the first one. Which of the following is not one of the typical traits of children on the autism spectrum disorder? Is it communication problems, social skill difficulties, academic difficulties, or repetitive behaviors or interests? Right, academic deficits. Even though they can be present in some students with autism, it's not typical. Those other 3 are typical traits and are the primary result of individuals on the autism spectrum disorder. All right, a teacher wants her students with ASD to learn how to cope and interact with various social situations. Which of the following would you recommend that I mentioned as a validated strategy? Is it PECs? Is it assistive communication devices? Is it positive behavioral supports? Or is it social stories? Social stories. Those could be extremely powerful in helping students learn the critical skills they're going to need to make friends and be independent in their adult life. All right, that's about it for this chapter. The next chapter, chapter 13, we're going to be talking about students with multiple severe disabilities. Be prepared. Make sure you've been keeping up on the reading. And I'm also going to include chapter 14 in the next presentation. So we'll be covering the last 2 chapters in one video. Once again, thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.